The convoy of black vehicles idled outside my house, their hazard lights cutting through the quiet evening. The convoy of black vehicles idled outside my house. A royal security detail stepped out, accompanied by a local police liaison to ensure formal protocol. Their uniforms were immaculate, and their expressions were entirely professional, reflecting the gravity of the situation. Neighbors whispered from their windows, but I tuned them out. The lead guard stepped forward. His tone was not a request. He stated that King Edward required my presence immediately. Have you ever been treated like a lower-class citizen by your own blood, only to have the ultimate authority prove them wrong? Leave a comment below. I want to hear your story. 3 days earlier, I sat at a table that felt more like a boardroom, where a hostile takeover was occurring. It was Stephanie's pre-wedding dinner, held at the most exclusive restaurant in the city. The chandeliers reflected off crystal glasses, casting fractured light across the pristine linen, but the atmosphere was purely transactional. I had been the silent investor in their version of family, and Stephanie was the CEO running it into the ground. At 31, she was a narcissist who demanded constant dividends from everyone around her. The evening dragged on, a grueling parade of false pleasantries and calculated insults directed at my career, my wardrobe, my very existence. They drank vintage wine and toasted to their own superiority. I sat quietly, sipping water, watching the performance. When the leather folder containing the final check arrived, the waiter hesitated, unsure of who to present it to. Stephanie did not miss a beat. She pointed directly at me. The bill was slid across the white tablecloth, landing heavily in front of me. $15,000. She smiled, her teeth perfectly white and perfectly sharp, calling it a small price for the disgrace I consistently brought to our family's image. My Aunt Marian and Uncle Silas nodded in agreement, their faces set in the same rigid lines of judgment. I did not cry. I did not ask why. Anger was not loud this time. It was entirely clinical. I rubbed my eyes, trying to summon a shred of regret, but there was only clarity. This was not an emotional breakdown. It was a balance sheet. I looked at the itemized receipt. Expensive champagne I had not touched. Wagyu steaks I had not ordered. Extravagant desserts consumed by people who despised me. It was a $15,000 invoice for the privilege of being insulted. I looked at Stephanie, who was already discussing her honeymoon as if I did not exist. I realized then the true, unvarnished nature of my family dynamic. The trap of cruel normalization is a systematic, insidious process. When you are exposed to constant, subtle devaluation, the toxic environment becomes your baseline reality. You start believing that buying their affection is simply the cost of doing business. You accept the cruelty because the alternative is admitting that the business is completely, irrevocably bankrupt. They did not see me as a sister or a niece. They saw me as an open line of credit. I was expected to finance my own humiliation without complaint. I pulled out my card and placed it in the folder. The waiter whisked it away. I sat there in silence, calculating the final total of what this family had cost me over the years. I watched my aunt and uncle raise their glasses to Stephanie, praising her for her impeccable taste and flawless execution of the evening. I was invisible, a mere utility to keep their luxurious facade intact. But I was no longer emotionally invested in their approval. I was just reviewing the data. Every sneer, every backhanded compliment, every financial demand was logged, categorized, and filed away. I was compiling the audit. The dinner concluded, and as we walked out of the restaurant, Stephanie did not even offer a simple thank you. She simply handed me her coat to hold while she hailed a cab. I folded the coat, handed it back to her without a word, and walked away into the night. The emotional deficit had finally eclipsed any residual loyalty I possessed. I went home that night and slept soundly. There was no anxiety, no lingering sadness, just the quiet, methodical preparation of a mind that had finally decided to liquidate its failing assets. To understand the sheer coldness of my reaction, you have to look back at the historical ledgers. For years, I willingly sacrificed my own capital to keep this dysfunctional family afloat. I was 28 years old, a military doctor, a woman who had seen actual war zones and operated under fire. Yet my greatest battles were invariably fought at family dinners. While Stephanie and my parents relentlessly drained every available resource, I paid for their mistakes. I funded their elaborate vacations, covered Stephanie's endless credit card debts, and stayed perfectly quiet when they claimed my achievements as their own parental successes. Why did I endure it for so long? It was not out of weakness or blind devotion, it was the calculated resignation of a survivor. When you spend your entire life on the edges of a family, you learn to conserve your energy for the fights that matter. You stop fighting back because you realize the return on investment is exactly zero. Affection in our household was treated like a premium subscription, and I had been footing the bill for a service I never actually received. I had traded my self-respect for a fragile, temporary peace, convincing myself that enduring their unquenchable greed was my fundamental duty as a daughter. I was the one who worked multiple exhausting jobs through medical school, taking grueling night shifts just to afford textbooks and basic necessities. I was the one who deployed to foreign countries, sleeping on cots in the mud, and saving lives under impossible conditions. Stephanie, meanwhile, was lavishly praised for merely existing. I was severely criticized for excellence, while she was continually rewarded for mediocrity. Every single accomplishment I had ever achieved was minimized, treated as a petty inconvenience that detracted from her grand narrative. When I received my medical degree, Aunt Marion loudly complained that the ceremony was too long and the seating was uncomfortable. When Stephanie bought a new designer handbag with my money, it was celebrated as a major life milestone. But that $15,000 dinner was the ultimate catalyst. It irrevocably closed the account. I realized that my blind loyalty was a rapidly depreciating asset. I stopped looking for their elusive approval and started looking strictly at the facts. They had taken absolutely everything I had to give and offered nothing but pure contempt in return. I was completely done financing my own abuse. The transaction was over. I went back to my apartment that night and began methodically organizing my files, systematically preparing to sever the financial ties once and for all. I reviewed my bank statements, immediately cutting off the automatic transfers I had previously set up for their convenience. I did not know that much higher powers were already auditing the family accounts on a significantly larger scale. I was prepared to simply walk away silently, writing them all off as a bad investment and moving forward with my military career. I genuinely thought the absolute worst they had done was drain my immediate financial resources. I was catastrophically wrong. The betrayal ran much deeper, woven maliciously into the very foundation of my life. But justice operates on its own precise timeline, and the final, devastating invoice was about to be delivered to their doorstep. The retaliation began precisely at 2 o'clock on Saturday. Stephanie's wedding was a masterclass in superficial luxury. Hundreds of elite guests gathered in a grand vaulted cathedral. I stood in the back, dressed in a simple gown, a necessary prop in her perfect performance. The string quartet played a delicate melody, and the air was thick with the scent of imported orchids. But the schedule was about to be abruptly amended. The heavy oak doors of the cathedral opened with a resounding thud. The music stopped abruptly, the cellist missing a note in pure shock. The guests recognized the distinct crest of the royal house on the guards' uniforms, and a sudden, heavy silence fell over the cathedral. It was as if everyone present understood that the social hierarchy they had gathered to celebrate was being rewritten in real time. The heavy oak doors of the cathedral opened with a resounding thud. A detachment of the royal guard stood at the entrance, followed by the king's chief legal counsel, a man whose reputation for ruthless justice preceded him. He walked straight past the bride, ignoring her bewildered groom, and stopped directly in front of me. 6 years ago in the Mediterranean, there was a catastrophic helicopter crash. I was a military doctor on a joint training exercise. I pulled a severely injured man from the burning wreckage and kept him alive for 6 grueling hours until evacuation arrived. I did not know he was a monarch. I just knew he was a patient bleeding out on the rocky shore. Now, a royal special representative stood before my family, his presence commanding the entire hall. He spoke of the king's silent regret as a guardian, having honored my request for anonymity for years while watching from afar. He declared that the crown could no longer remain a passive observer to such blatant exploitation. He bowed his head to me, a gesture of profound respect from a sovereign. The power dynamic did not shift. It completely shattered. The elite guests murmured in shock, their eyes darting between the king and me. Stephanie stood at the altar, her face pale, Her perfect day hijacked by reality, Aunt Marion and Uncle Silas shrank back in their pews, suddenly realizing how small they truly were. The king was not just there to offer royal gratitude. He was there to deliver absolute justice. He signaled to one of his senior advisors, who stepped forward and handed me a sealed envelope. It was aged, the edges worn, and yellowed with time. I recognized the meticulous handwriting instantly. It was from my late father, a man who had died in combat years ago, leaving a void this family had quickly filled with greed. The king explained, his voice cold and strictly analytical, that his intelligence network had uncovered a series of massive financial anomalies tied directly to my father's estate. When my father died, he had left a substantial inheritance, meant to be divided equally to secure my future. Stephanie, with the active, calculated complicity of Aunt Marion and Uncle Silas, had systematically forged the necessary legal documents. They had quietly funneled millions into untraceable offshore accounts, leaving me with nothing but the burden of their expectations and debts. The king presented the ironclad proof to the stunned crowd. Bank statements, transfer records, forged signatures verified by top forensic experts. The $15,000 dinner was a mere rounding error compared to what they had ruthlessly stolen from me over the years. I opened the envelope. My father's letter detailed his true intentions, his profound pride in my military service, and his deep fear that Stephanie's narcissism would ultimately destroy the family. He had entrusted the truth to a firm, but Stephanie had leveraged identity theft and forged authorizations to divert all legal correspondence to her own private servers, effectively silencing the truth for years. The king's elite investigators had dismantled the entire operation in a matter of days. After these investigators presented the irrefutable evidence to the federal court, the judge expedited the warrants to prevent the suspects from fleeing the jurisdiction. I looked at the documents in my hands. I felt no shock, no panic, no despair. It was pure, unadulterated clarity. My family was not just cruel, they were organized criminals. They had funded their lavish lifestyles, including this very extravagant wedding, with my stolen future. The affection I had desperately tried to earn was financed by my own stolen inheritance. It was the ultimate breach of contract. Now, I realized that their constant draining demands for money weren't just greedy, they were a calculated strategy to keep me financially dependent and completely unaware of the wealth that was rightfully mine. They had stolen my capital and then charged me exponential interest for the dubious privilege of their company. The extensive audit was complete. The financial discrepancies were glaringly obvious, and the collection agency had arrived with royal backing. The climax was clinical and thoroughly devastating. Stephanie's face twisted in sheer panic. She tried to laugh it off, attempting to hastily reframe the overwhelming evidence as a simple accounting misunderstanding. She looked at her wealthy groom, at his elite family seated in the front rows, desperately trying to salvage the merger. But the king's lawyers stepped forward, carrying briefcases filled with damning, undeniable paperwork. They did not argue. They simply distributed copies of the indictment directly to the groom's family. Aunt Marion and Uncle Silas stammered, their usual arrogance instantly replaced by sweating, palpable fear. They tried to claim the money was used for my upbringing, a pathetic, mathematically impossible attempt to justify their massive fraud. The king silenced them with a single sharp look. The king silenced them with a sharp gesture. On his signal, federal authorities entered the cathedral, documents in hand. They announced that a high-level freeze had been placed on all global assets tied to the fraud, and official warrants were served for the immediate arrest of the 3 individuals on charges of grand embezzlement, forgery, and financial conspiracy. Stephanie's groom did not hesitate. He took one look at the documents, his face hardening as he turned to his own attorney. Cancel the accounts, nullify the merger, and ensure we have zero contact with these people, he commanded. He walked out of the cathedral without a word, his family following close behind. Stephanie's social and financial ruin was broadcast to the highest echelons of society in real time. There was no screaming match. There was no tearful confrontation. I watched them crumble under the crushing weight of their own corruption. I did not gloat. I did not smile. I just watched the ledger balance itself with brutal efficiency. They weren't shocked by the horrifying nature of what they had done. They were shocked that I had stopped playing along and that the long overdue audit had finally caught up with them. The wedding was canceled. Their illicit accounts were seized. The grand facade they had spent decades building was incinerated in less than 10 minutes. The government didn't just arrest them, they initiated immediate asset forfeiture, seizing everything they had acquired with the stolen funds, leaving them with nothing but the clothes on their backs. The guests filed out in uncomfortable silence, leaving my family standing alone amidst the expensive floral arrangements they could no longer afford. I turned and walked out of the cathedral alongside the king, my steps measured and calm. I left them entirely to their bankruptcy, walking into the sunlight with a perfectly clear balance sheet. In the weeks that followed, the legal system finalized the transaction. Stephanie, Marion, and Silas faced severe prison sentences for their extensive financial crimes. I reclaimed my inheritance, recovering every single stolen dollar, complete with years of compounded interest. I did not seek further revenge. Revenge is inefficient. I chose absolute freedom. I resigned from my military commission, ready to deploy my skills on my own terms. I established a charitable foundation dedicated to global healthcare initiatives. We fund medical education and provide resources for young women who have no family support, ensuring they never have to rely on toxic benefactors. I became the CEO of my own life, investing my time and resources only in people who provided a positive emotional return. The debt was permanently settled, the toxic accounts irrevocably closed. But to anyone listening who feels like the black sheep, I want to say this. This is a letter to those who always feel on the edges. I know the quiet agony of trying to earn your place at a table where the seats are already assigned to others. I know how you shrink yourself, hoping that if you take up less space, if you ask for less, they might finally love you. But love is not a debt you have to work off. You are not a burden, and you are not a supporting character in someone else's story. You have been the silent investor in relationships that are bankrupting your soul. I've come to realize that true strength isn't enduring endless cruelty with a smile. It is having the courage to close the account and walk away. Forgiveness isn't always for the other person. Sometimes it's the only way to set yourself free from the resentment that threatens to consume you. But remember this, forgiveness does not mean access. You can forgive them while locking the door, changing the codes, and throwing away the key. You have the absolute right to walk away from anyone who diminishes your light or charges you for their basic decency. Do not let their inability to see your worth dictate your value. They are not the market standard. Build your own table. Find your own people. Invest in the relationships that build you up instead of tearing you down. The best retaliation is not destruction. It is living a life so profoundly beautiful, so incredibly fulfilling, and so entirely your own that their darkness can no longer reach you. You are the architect of your own legacy, and it is time to start building.